about black demonstration of competence, about black independence. Since we refused to behave like second-class citizens, powerful whites decided to force us to submit to a social order that physically pushed us out of the realm of citizenship. The challenges to Jim Crow, which were always thrumming just beneath the surface of society, burst forth into furious flower in the aftermath of World War II. I say all of this because during the heyday of Jim Crow, during this brutal period of lynchings and evictions from railroad cars or buses, or the wholesale destruction of black neighborhoods by white mobs, throughout all of this, the Confederate flag was not a major symbol of this order. Like the flag of the 1920s. In fact, the battle flag does not make its reappearance on a wide scale until the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. The very same time that lawyers argued the major lawsuits to end housing and educational discrimination. The very same time when black organizations filed petitions at the United Nations charging that the United States' treatment of blacks violated international agreements on genocide. The very same time when Rosa Parks refused to stand up and Fannie Lou Hamer refused to shut up. It was in that time and in those places that the flag waved as a signal that we should move to the back of the social order, that we should shut up because our words had no meaning. It was in this time and in those places that the flag waved as a signal that we could not find social justice. It was in that time and in those places that the flag waved as if to say that we were not entitled to government protection, even when our bodies and our dreams and our most basic rights were being violated. Again, we refused to submit. Amid church bombings and kidnappings, we organized ourselves and organized across racial and ethnic lines to create justice where there had been none. Filled with the spirit of Emancipation Day, we sowed seeds for a new spring. We defied the Confederate flag and turned our backs to the winter of our subjugation. Sadly, within a generation of Martin and Malcolm and Rosa and Fannie, Diane Nash and Guy and Candy Carawan, we find ourselves facing that flag again. And once again, we find ourselves in need of the spirit of Emancipation Day. Once again, we find ourselves living in frightful times. We find ourselves living in the days of the new American empire, in the days of Katrina. Make no mistake, we are living in a dangerous time because our president has committed our military to fight a war of conquest. Make no mistake, the war and occupation of Iraq is immoral, illegal, and racist. I know that some of you may have friends or relatives. I know that some of you may have friends or relatives serving during this dreadful time, so let me be clear. This is not an indictment of the women and men of our armed services. This is an indictment of a foreign policy that is arrogant and morally bankrupt. A policy that has made the world less safe and is fostering the growth of would-be terrorists. It is no coincidence that supporters of the Confederate flag bellow the loudest in this time of empire. The first attempts at creating and expanding an informal American empire took wing in the 1870s as Reconstruction was dying out, and they reached their height during the Spanish-American War. It is no accident that Jim Crow segregation received full legal legitimacy in the form of Plessy versus Ferguson at about the same time that Americans claimed control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. It is no accident that these domestic and international events converge because at the root of a modern empire, whether it is British or French or Belgian, was a clear belief in white supremacy. The original goals of this war of conquest were to stop an imminent threat to the safety of the United States and to mete out justice for the crimes of 9/11. Now that those justifications have proven to be lies, we are told that the military is there to spread democracy as a way of combating terrorism. But with each passing day and each increase in the various death tolls, we reach the inescapable conclusion that there was no terrorism in Iraq until after the invasion. We reach the inescapable conclusion that more people around the globe consider the United States to be the greatest threat to world peace. We reach the inescapable conclusion that the very same people in Iraq who wanted Saddam Hussein gone in the first place are the very people that want us gone now. It is no coincidence that Iraqi pain is irrelevant to American government calculation. It is no coincidence that Iraqi voices must not be heard. It is no coincidence that no one is being held accountable for these lies and distortions. This is fundamental to white supremacy and the old order. Only the fears and desires of whites and fantasies are important. No one and nothing else matters, and no one will ever be held responsible for the crimes committed in support of racist delusions and flights of fancy. The supporter of the Confederate flag would tell you that he is a true patriot, even as he celebrates a group of traitors to the nation. Much like the supporter of the flag, the supporter of war must grapple with the cognitive dissonance inside the claim that you can teach people to love freedom and democracy by bonding them into submission. So now the battle flag slaps us in the face, as if slavery vanished alongside weapons of mass destruction, and the lynchings and rape of the old order disappeared with evidence of secret meetings between Saddam and Al-Qaeda. We are commanded to support the president in time of war and to respect Southern heritage. But I ask, whose war is it? And what South are you talking about? And as if we didn't have enough proof of the corruption of our leadership, of decades worth of neoconservative efforts to push us back to the back of the social order, here comes Katrina. Katrina brought Category 5 winds and rain to blow away the deceit of compassionate conservatives and to wash off the facade of supply-side economics. This tremendous cataclysm wrought on New Orleans and much of the surrounding Gulf Coast brought us a tragedy in two parts, the act of God and the acts of man. The storm itself is what lawyers would call a force majeure, a force of nature, an act of God. Yet the immediate aftermath of the storm brought a crime against humanity. It is a crime so venal and complex that it deserves at least a brief look through its multiple layers. At one level, the crime was based on the politicization of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. President Bush made FEMA a part of the Department of Homeland Security and appointed to its leadership men who had no experience in disaster relief. Their only qualification was that they had served as Bush campaign operatives and contributors. Not only is this a political crime, a reflection of the oldest type of affirmative action in America, but it is a civic crime because their incompetence threatened to kill thousands and harm millions, which it did. At another level, the acts of Michael Brown and his subordinates at FEMA cannot simply be judged on the basis of what they didn't do a few weeks ago. They have to be understood in the context of what they did do last year. During Labor Day weekend 2004, Hurricane Frances made landfall in central Florida. Although there was severe damage in Orlando and other towns in that region, the storm's outer bands barely scraped Miami-Dade County, 100 miles to the south. Nevertheless, FEMA approved claims of roughly $28 million for new furniture, clothes, televisions, microwaves, refrigerators, and other appliances, even though Frances felt like a severe thunderstorm in South Florida. During the recent congressional debates about relief aid to the victims of Katrina, Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who represents Miami-Dade County in the U.S. Congress, raised the need to reform FEMA before giving it any more money because of the overwhelming evidence of politically motivated corruption. Specifically, the Congresswoman reported that during the entire hurricane season of 2004, the state of Florida officially reported 123 deaths related to all the hurricanes. Yet FEMA paid $1.7 million in funeral expenses for 315 deaths. These deaths included a Palm Beach Gardens millionaire who was recovering from heart surgery and died 2 days before Hurricane Frances hit, a Miami baby who was not yet born when the storm arrived, and a Port Charlotte man who died of cirrhosis of the liver and heart failure 5 months after Hurricane Charlie had passed. How could FEMA do this? They could do this by directly approaching doctors, either with visits to the physician's office, asking that she or he relate the particular death to the hurricane, or by sending the physician a form letter indicating what she could write in order to get the funeral benefit for the family. The form letters included the name of the FEMA agent and a telephone and fax number in case the doctor had questions or wanted to fax the completed form back to FEMA. So what we see is that FEMA can act when it wants to. It can act to solicit fraud. It can act to invite felonies and waste of our tax dollars. Where still is what may look like crimes of omission in New Orleans are crimes of commission. Jefferson Parish President Aaron Broussard wept on live TV as he recounted the abandonment of southern Louisiana by the federal government on the September 4th edition of Meet the Press. Broussard gave 3 examples of FEMA's bad conduct. When the parish asked Walmart to send water, Walmart sent 3 tractor trailers filled with water, but FEMA turned them back before they got to the parish, saying that the people didn't need the water. When a Coast Guard vessel docked in the parish with 1,000 gallons of diesel fuel, the boat was turned away before parish officials could get the fuel. The explanation was, FEMA said, don't give you the fuel. To make matters worse, 6 days after the storm hit, as first responders were trying to do whatever they could with the limited resources they had, FEMA agents came to the parish and cut the emergency communication lines. While thousands of people lay dead or near dying in the streets of the city, FEMA set up military checkpoints which allowed no one out of the area around the convention center. While thousands of people and their pets straddle uneasily on rooftops and in trees, Bush circled the city in his plane like some shimmering vulture, waiting just for the right time. In 1927, white authorities refused to evacuate black victims for fear that this labor force might never return to the Delta. Under the old order, it was better that they died and served as human sandbags to shore up the levees than live and put the lie to racial paternalism. All of these acts of criminality and negligence attempt to disappear our pain and silence our continual cries that this supposedly new system of conservative government is fatally flawed. They show us that in these days of empire, the role of government is not to protect its citizens, but to protect the powerful. They show us that the very idea of a nation has been upended so that we are told to be servants of the president rather than the other way around. All of these acts of criminality and negligence show us that there can be no real compassion and no political democracy until there is economic democracy. Yet in spite of our dismay and sadness, there is good news. The good news is that the waters of Katrina can help us grow new flowers. The good news is reflected in what we do here today and tomorrow. By honoring those who kept alive the spirit of Emancipation Day, we sow the seeds for new flowers, for a new spring. By maintaining our celebration of Emancipation Day, we refuse to surrender to the symbolic tyranny of the Confederate flag. By maintaining our celebration of Emancipation Day, we refuse to surrender to the legal and political tyranny of neoconservative ideologues who do not know the true meaning of freedom. By maintaining our celebration of Emancipation Day, we refuse to surrender to despair. Although history tells us of the various efforts to strip us of our humanity and our citizenship, it also teaches us of the indomitable spirit of black people and of all people of conscience. History teaches us that even when Confederate officers claimed that their slaves would fight with them, that a Robert Smalls would emerge, take control of a Confederate Navy vessel, and sail it across Union lines and join the fight for freedom. History teaches us that even when a white mob destroyed the entire Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the black survivors rebuilt that town, kept alive the memory of the tragedy, and eventually won some forms of reparations. History teaches us when segregationists argued that black people were happy living as peons, people like Fannie Lou Hamer, Robert Williams, or Bob Moses would say no. Through pickets and rallies and sit-ins and songs, they would say 1,000 times, no. History teaches us that even as so-called experts now talk about how primitive we are or how inferior we are, there are sages like the late, great Ossie Davis who remind us of our own beauty, wisdom, and strength. Who left a life of sharecropping in the Georgia Lowcountry 2 decades before, only in order to return to claim property that belonged to his family. On the plantation where Pearlie grew up lies the Big Bethel Church. But Pearlie knows that the plantation owner, Stonewall Jackson Cotchapee, wouldn't readily sell the church to Pearlie, or fear that it would lead the local colored folks to start acting out of their place. Indeed, that is what Pearlie hopes. Because to him, the church and its bell were a symbol of freedom, and he hopes to use the church to challenge the old order of segregation and white supremacy, which old Captain Cotchapee holds so dear. Pearlie succeeds in his quest to get the deed to the church, and even welcomes old Captain's son Charlie to become its first white member. Of course, when old Captain Cotchapee learned that his son helped Pearlie get the deed and that he wanted to join Big Bethel, he suffered a heart attack and died standing up. In the final act of the play, Pearlie prepares to leave the plantation to spread the word of freedom across the countryside. But before he goes, he leads the members of the Big Bethel Church of the New Freedom in burying old Captain Kotzebue and the old order which he represented. He rings the bell at the church, eulogizes the man who was his greatest tormentor, and gives one last ray of hope to his friends and family. So, in praise of all these gardeners who are with us today, who are toiling to bring us new flowers through Emancipation Day, I leave you with the word of Reverend Pearlie Victorious Judson. Tonight, my friends, I find in being black a thing of beauty, a joy, a strength, a secret cup of gladness, a native land in neither time nor place, a native land in every Negro face. Be loyal to yourselves, your skin, your hair, your lips, your southern speech, your laughing kindness. Accept in full the sweetness of your blackness, not wishing to be red, nor white, nor yellow, nor any other race or face, but this. Farewell, my deep and Africanic sisters and brothers. Be brave. Keep freedom in the family. Do what you can for the white folks, and write to me in care of the post office. Now may the Constitution of the United States go with you, the Bill of Rights protect you, and the State Commission Against Discrimination keep the eyes of the law upon you, henceforth, now and forevermore. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. At this time, we're going to take a little break. And you all can use the bathroom, get some water if you need to. We will meet back here for Dr. Daniel Williams' presentation at 1:45.
It is my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Daniel Williams. Mr. Williams received his bachelor's degree from Brooklyn College of the City University of New York. He later received his master's degree from the University of Oregon, where he studied with Ansel Adams, among others. Mr. Williams has spent 20 years photographing African Americans as they celebrate their freedom from slavery, and is best known for his documentary work on Emancipation Day celebrations. The Ohio University Professor Emeritus of Photography has captured on film more than 20 Emancipation Day events in 8 states. Mr. Williams has lectured and given shows across the country, and his photographs have been exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City and the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of American Arts in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Mr. Daniel Williams.
First of all, it really is an honor for me to be here and to be a part of this conference. You don't know, I guess you know what it means to me, because I'm sure it means a lot to you. We at Ohio University in November, we'll have our 4th annual conference, which is similar to this. So I just want you to know you are not alone. Other communities are doing the same thing. They're exploring their presence, they're exploring their past, and trying to understand how it relates to our future. So we're all digging in and finding out who we are and what we're all about. And that's very good, and especially in this day and age. And again, I'm very pleased to be a part of this. It was right up my alley, so to speak, because I've been trying to spread the word. I've been spreading the word about Emancipation Day celebration for about almost 30 years now. I was trained as an artist, a documentary photographer, and in fact, when I first started teaching at Ohio University back in 1969, I was doing a project on African American farmers, because I would hear so much about how, if I just wanted to know the role of farming, how farming has played a significant role in the development of this country. It started out as an agricultural country. And in fact, slaves were selected from different parts of Africa because of their agricultural know-how. Rice growing along the Carolinas. You took slaves from the Colonies who raised rice. And you took slaves because of their skills. So to hear, even from the beginning, we had skills. They knew we had skills. And that's how they selected us, because of various aspects of their economy that they wanted to improve on. We did all of the metal work on the farms, did all of the iron work. We did do all of that. So going back to why I'm here, why I'm so thrilled to be here is, so I've been studying the black farmer, and then after I finished a shoot in southern Ohio, the farmer said to me, "Are you coming back next week?" And I said, "Well, I'm done." He says, "Well, we're going to be celebrating Emancipation." And I said, "Well, what is that?" I know of the Emancipation Proclamation. He said, "Well, that's what we're celebrating, our freedom." And I thought back to when I was in the 5th grade. I went to public school in New York, and the teaching faculty in most of the city schools are Jewish, and so they celebrate Passover. So during Passover, the substitute teacher said to me, "Well, we're celebrating our emancipation from Pharaoh. Do you celebrate your emancipation?" And I didn't have a clue. We observed Emancipation Day in public school after the January 2nd or 3rd. We observed it, but we never really celebrated it. So when this farmer said to me, coming back from Emancipation, I went back the next week, and what I saw just blew my mind. I never finished my project on the black farmer. I'll go back to it someday. I've been photographing Emancipation Day celebrations ever since. They're very important to me. So this event here in southern Ohio, Gallipolis, Ohio, they've been celebrating Emancipation Day since 1863, since the pre-proclamation address in 1862. They've been celebrating it. So they claim to have the longest ongoing celebration of emancipation in the country. Well, every area, I guess, makes that claim. And part of what you're doing, part of what we're doing, is to try and make some kind of chronograph as to who is doing what, and at some point it will be compiled, because my sources say one thing, other sources say others, and so at some point it's going to be all sorted out and put in some kind of order that tells what it was really like. So these women here, this is the Emancipation Queen and her court. And these are not 18 and 19-year-old beauties. These are our elder beauties, where age is respected. And that's an African tradition going all the way back. So this was done in 1982, I think. 1982. And it's pretty much my trademark photograph with Emancipation Day celebrations. Go to the next one. Here we go. These Emancipation Day celebrations are basically family gatherings, and most of my images have to do with family gatherings. And they're holding, this is like 3 generations here, and the older woman is holding a photograph of her participation in Emancipation Day, going back when she was a young girl. So it's very important that we hold on to that history. Again, more family gatherings. This is in the Gallia County Fairgrounds in southeastern Ohio. And this was an important stop on the Underground Railroad because the Ohio River was the borderline. I'm going to sort of go through these. I don't have a particular story with each picture, but I just want you to get the flavor of what I've documented. Here we have a gospel group, because religion plays a very, very important part in these Emancipation Day celebrations. These are events that affirm the family, and we have always had a strong family ties. This documentary project that I do helps to explore the issue of the black family. Of course, when we talk about the breakup of the black family, we're talking about a nuclear family, not the extended family. When we talk about the extended family, then we talk about family. The expression, it takes a village to raise a child, comes from that. Here we have some games, adults and children come together to play. Now, Ohio isn't the only place that celebrates Emancipation Day celebrations. I would go around and take a slide projector to the various states and show them that others are doing the same thing. And they would be very surprised with this information because slavery, we all don't celebrate Emancipation Day on the same day. Slavery was dealt with as a state-by-state issue. So different states, especially in the North, ended slavery during various times. New York ended slavery in 1853, and so on. I don't have the whole list of which state did what and when, but each state dealt with slavery in its own time frame. So there is no one sweeping day in which we celebrate freedom. So in Police, we celebrated in September, and so what we did is I showed them these Emancipation Day celebrations in Thomaston, Georgia. So we chartered 2 buses, and we all went down to Thomaston, Georgia during Thomaston's Emancipation Day celebration. This was a break we took just outside of Atlanta. We stopped for a prayer meeting. And during the prayer meeting, we took a group photograph. And so we visited Thomaston, Georgia. Now, this particular Emancipation celebration event, this is what they do in Paducah, Kentucky. They go all out. This is the August 8th homecoming, and it's similar to, it's the same date that you are celebrating here, that you're talking about here. And as part of their celebration, of course, it involves a cruise on the Ohio River. And every year they honor a favorite son. And here's a photograph of 2 women on the cruise, on the boat. This particular celebration back in 1983 was honoring Fate Marable, the well-known musician who was said to have given Louis Armstrong his first job. And he's a native son of Paducah, Kentucky, and so they are honoring him with a headstone. And this is his granddaughter reading a statement. And here's a close-up of the headstone. So he's finally getting a headstone. But as part of their tradition, they honor a native son who has gone out into the world and has done well, which is a very important part of their tradition. And of course, religion is the backbone to all of this, because all of these emancipation celebrations are put together and planned by church committees. The church is very, very important in this. And so they play a very important role in organizing, planning, and carrying these events out, because these events, to keep order, to keep it meaningful, to give it a sense of history, it requires a lot of planning. And this represents well, they call it the granddaddy of them all because it's Juneteenth, Houston, Texas. And this is the largest annual celebration, and they celebrate their Emancipation Day on June 19th. And this is the celebration in Houston, Texas, and it's slaves were freed from Texas 3 months after the war. General Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox in April, and the war didn't officially end in Texas until June, when General Granger landed at Galveston and actually marched through and freed the slaves. So they call it Juneteenth there. And I saw my first black cowboy. Now, I've been growing up, I grew up with the old Saturday Westerns at the movies, and I never saw any black cowboys. But historically, literally 3 out of 5 cowpunchers were black. Exactly. And I could see if they were just 1 in 10, but 3 out of 5. How could Hollywood have neglected us? How could Hollywood have? My first black cowboy was Willie Von Little in Blazing Saddles. So these folks here set me straight. And this is and they have these riding clubs. So these are the Circle Riders of Houston, Texas. And so there's a very strong tradition here, along with, and athletic events, of course, are very important. They have a track and field event, an annual track and field event that they do. This is a candlelight ceremony. A couple of years ago, in 2000, the Ohio Historical Society was recognizing Underground Railroad sites throughout the communities in Ohio. And this is recognizing the town of Gallipolis. It's right across the river from Point Pleasant, West Virginia. But of course, before the Civil War, it was all Virginia. West Virginia seceded from Virginia because they didn't want to take part in the war. So had runaway slaves coming right across into Cincinnati, into Gallipolis, Ohio, and many of these places. So this is a dedication of one of these sites in Ohio. So they had a candlelight ceremony on the river. These are the participants holding the candles. And then the next day, at the actual meeting house that sheltered slaves, runaway slaves, we have this dedication ceremony and unveiling. And they had the reenactment of the Emancipation Proclamation reading. So you have someone impersonating Lincoln, and someone impersonating Frederick Douglass, and someone impersonating Harriet Tubman. So it was really a wonderful ceremony. And that's a sampling of the some of the Emancipation Day events, just a few out of many that I went to. And I do have still photographs over in the corner that I'll talk with you about. I have T-shirts and posters, announcements, and everything like that to give you some more information. Now, one of the most serendipitous moments in this whole project was when I went to Ghana in 2002. Now, Ghana, as you know, was one of the departing points for slaves. Ghana and Senegal, Dakar, Senegal, Gorée Island, and you have the Cape Coast Castle in Cape Coast, Ghana. And what did I see? Emancipation Day celebration over there. Now, the Prime Minister of Ghana came to the United States back in 2000 and went to Juneteenth and was so impressed with Emancipation Day celebrations that as a part of bringing African American tourists over to visit some of these castles, they've begun doing a Emancipation Day celebration. So this was their second Emancipation Day. And for you historians in the crowd, W.E.B. Du Bois spent his last years in Ghana. He died at Accra. And we visited his tomb, we visited his office, where all of his papers are. So this was actually a commemoration of him and his work along with the Emancipation Day celebration. So here the diaspora has come full circle. And I was also exhibiting some of my work about Emancipation Day celebrations in the National Museum in Accra. So again, I'm bringing the word about Emancipation Day celebrations over here, over to Africa. And they greeted my work with enthusiasm and interest. And these are the dancing groups, cultural dancing groups that were part of the museum show opening. They had a group of African American artists bringing their work over there, and I was a part of the group, and this was our reception over there. And this is Cape Coast Castle, and they have this pageant play that they do for tourists, which kind of explains the slave trade in summary. So here we have the March of the Kings, and in the background we have the colonialists stalking them. And here they spot the colonialists. They don't know what they're there for, but of course they welcome them because we've always trusted them. It's part of our blessing and our downfall, some may say. And here now these are actors who, of course, wear the masks of the colonists. But ironically, there's John F. Kennedy and Mick Jagger and Mr. Bean, the British comedian. But I don't know, maybe they were playing the joke as well. But these are the actors in the play. And I thought that this made a pretty powerful image myself. This is part of the collection. This image is in the Smithsonian Institution. It's part of the collection of my work in the National Museum of American Art. And this, for me, tells the whole story from my experience there. And here we have the gathering of the slaves in a symbolic manner. And here are all of the tourists, myself among them. But I got up out of my seat and sort of mingled with the actors, went behind the stage and got these photographs. And this is sort of an overview of the Cape Castle, Alina Castle courtyard. And this is where we were gathered after we were captured from the countryside. Now, the slave trade, of course, needed the cooperation of a lot of people. That also included tribes of Africans as well. But given the proposition that if you don't find others, we'll take you, they had no choice. And this is a group of, when you go to visit these these castle dungeons, of course, the tour guides are very knowledgeable and try to give you a sense of what it was like. And so here, this is a group of artists. We all went as a group, and we're sort of holding hands and meditating in this courtyard where we were gathered, and you can see the skull and crossbones over some of the entrances to the lower chambers in the dungeons. But this is where we were held until we were shipped to the various colonies that used slave labor. Here's a closer image of that. It was a very efficient operation because you had this was a fort. You had soldiers living there. The commanders of the fort lived in the upper area. The soldiers lived on the ground level, and of course the slaves were in the lower chambers. And here we go down into some of the dungeons, and these places, these holding chambers, were inhuman in terms of the conditions there. Generally, you were ankle deep in dung and excrement and everything, and the odor was tremendous. And you see these little grooves down there. These little grooves were all pathways where urine and other excrements could be washed away. I've done a whole series on these chambers, and I'm going to do an installation using these chamber walls. And it's a very eerie feeling when you're walking around down in these chambers. It's just hard to believe that people were kept in for so long and then put into the halls of slave ships where the conditions were even worse. And talk about a Holocaust. This was our Holocaust, and very few of us survived. And when you look around the room, all of you, all of us, this is what we survived. This is who we are. This is what we've come through, and we are strong because of that. This is a griot who sits there and accepts your offering. It's a kind of altar. As you can see, the doorways are so small, only one person at a time can fit through it. So there was no sense of, let's charge and try and break out. These dungeons were constructed to prevent any kind of rebellion or escape. Some did manage, but as you can see, as we experienced when we walked through these chamber doors, you can only get through them one at a time. So if you can imagine being packed in this room like sardines and trying to move through them, it was quite an experience. These are some of the air shaft chambers where they would try to ventilate and pour water down to try and wash away some of the human waste. Now, if you tilt your head slightly, this was the door that we walked through as we marched down to the ships. This is called the Door of No Return. And as a final picture, I thought that the words of Harriet Tubman on the shirt of one of the visitors was very appropriate, called "Keep Going. If you're tired, keep going. If you're scared, keep going. Keep going. If you love freedom, keep going." And it has a lot of relevance for us today. So. Well, my son lives in Nigeria. He is a development consultant. He spent 3 years there, 4 years. He does farm tech work, genetic engineering crops. He does all kinds of things. And he's doing consulting on his own now. He used to work for NGOs. But I'll tell you what, This is how foreign aid works. When we talk about giving money to countries, underdeveloped countries, we don't give them the money. We don't give them the money. We, in essence, give them a credit card, and they have to buy from us. So American companies bid for the contracts from these foreign governments, and they actually do the work. So it's like buying from the company's store. So your money is not given away. And don't be brainwashed by politicians who say we're wasting your taxpayer money is going to waste. It's not going to waste. It's hiring Americans to do the work. So it's not. The money is not going to Nigeria. The money is not going to Afghanistan. The money is not going to wherever. The money is going to American companies to do the work. So my son decided, well, I'll be my own company. So he gets on contracts. Before that, he spent 5 years in Indonesia, installing windmills to create electric power for irrigation and all that stuff. So my kids I guess they're children of the world. They travel around the world, they work around the world. They don't live in the States anymore. They've left home since they were 12, 13 years old. They've been very independent. And I used to take my daughter to these Emancipation Day celebrations. She would come kicking and screaming. Why are you taking me? Oh, your children actually listen to you. Believe it or not, they listen. They listen because it comes out in later years. And to this day, she thanks me for all of that experience. And that's why she's teaching African American history now. So my kids have traveled the world. My son is back in the States now, and he should be arriving in Athens next week sometime. So I can hang out with him a little bit before he goes back over. I see them, and it gives me a chance to travel too. So I travel and see them and do them. So. Yes.
Yeah, I'm interested in the trip you organized for people from Gallipolis.
Gallipolis, Ohio, right.
Down to Thomaston.
Down to Thomaston.
Both groups say they have the oldest, longest continuous
right.
observation. So I'm
well,
interested
well,
in
that's been
took place down there.
Well, the discussion that Mr. George Carricker, who was the organizer for the celebration in Thomaston, we all got together, and so we settled the issue. It says, well, we have posters that go back to 1863, and of course, when did Sherman march to Georgia? That's because that's when it was settled by looking at history.
Ohio wins.
Ohio won. Again. And the celebration that I went to in Juneteenth in 1982, that was the 12th annual one, because they were disrupted during the Second World War. They stopped. A lot of these celebrations broke down at the turn of the last century. There were the great migrations after World War I and after World War II. Many of us left the South and moved to northern cities. So when we accumulated in the ghettos in the northern cities, there were people from many different places sharing the same 5 or 6 square blocks. So there was no common celebration day among them, so there wasn't any going out in the street and having a festival. People went back to their hometowns to celebrate individually, so there was no concerted effort to do that. Now they do it in Detroit as part of the as a tail off of the celebrations that they have in Windsor, Canada, because the British colony, the United Kingdom, freed its slaves in the 1835 to 1840. Each island was to be freed through some kind of staggered system. So before the Civil War in the States, Canada, slaves were freed in Canada. Many of them went to Canada. And so they would have their celebrations in Canada. And you would have these sympathetic celebrations in the free states in the North as a way of lobbying for the abolition of slavery in the United States. But many of the Caribbean celebrations are actually emancipation celebrations. The annual Splash Day they have in Jamaica, the Carnival in Trinidad, they're all emancipation Day celebrations. Yes?
Dr. Williams, I would like to make one or two comments and then a question.
Yes.
From my history in my country, I'm from Liberia, West Africa.
Okay.
We were taught in my history that the chiefs from back home, they sold our people for things like salt,
Right.
tobacco, liquor, and so on like that. And also that the concept of slavery in the African context,
Very different.
it was far different from
Very different.
what they expected over here.
Exactly.
And then
Are you Americo-Liberian or are you?
no, red-blooded Liberian.
Okay, because
Native Liberian.
you were not allowed in the presidential palace until very recently.
Yeah, sure.
Because Liberia, as it was established by the United States, you know, the religious groups in America, the Methodists, and so on, we may think of them as being benevolent in terms of educating Africans. They were educating them to send them back. And that's what Liberia was all about, to send them back. So it wasn't any generous, it wasn't out of any kind of generosity. It was to get rid of them, but let's give them something to go back with.
Yeah.
So many of them did not. Like, if you look at the dispute between Garvey and Du Bois, Garvey, of course, wanted to go back, establishing the Black Star Lines. But of course, that was sabotaged by the American government, because the colonialists, the European governments who had colonies in Africa, told America that you can't allow this to happen because we don't want any agitations, we don't want any trouble in our colonies. So they sabotaged Marcus Garvey's Black Star Line, and they indicted him for mail fraud.
And you mentioned earlier about Du Bois.
Yes,
The Firestone Company over here has a branch in my country.
right.
And the portion of land that they bought from my country, way back then, Du Bois told my government to not even sell it to Firestone. Because the rubber that makes your tire, majority of that comes from my country.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, you know, so he refused for them to sell it, but at that point in time, because the government was in a jam, I think they offered $10 million. And since then, up to now, Firestone has made more than $100 million over there. You know, but my question would be, if you don't mind, do you know the houses you showed in your picture?
Yeah, the castles?
Yeah.
Castle, yeah.
And especially the last one, the point of no return.
Right.
Do you know whether those were built by the slave traders or
They were built by the Dutch.
Okay.
Because the first traders through there were, well, actually they were the Spanish, because back then, Holland was a colony of Spain. Back then, in the 18th, where are the historians here? Give me some help.
Portuguese.
Yeah, the
16th century.
Yeah, back in the 16th century, Holland was a colony of Spain. In fact, much of the bullion from the Incas and the Aztecs was melted down, sent back to Spain, and they invested that money in building Amsterdam. So this beautiful, the city of Amsterdam in Holland was an investment that Spain made in their colony, and they did that with the bullion from South America. But back then, I think it was Pope Leo the 11th divided the world. They said Spain will have this half and Portugal will have that half. And that's why they speak Portugal in Brazil and Spanish everywhere else in the New World. Yes. Oh, you said you had another
No,
question?
that was it. That was it, sir.
Okay. All right. Yes.
Excuse me. August 8th,
Mm-hmm.
throughout the United States,
Uh-huh.
was used for business in different areas of the United States. For an example, my wife can verify this when we're together, in Coletta, West Virginia,
Mm-hmm.
August 8th was a festival that West Virginia coal mine used to recruit baseball players to come into the area.
Mm-hmm.
And they in turn would sell them to the farm system on the East Coast. Nowadays, it is still being used to raise funds for special groups, specialized groups.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I talked with the historian about that, and he said that was the biggest fundraising date in the history of Coletta, West Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do we get all the state built back on the main line? How do we get the people involved to bring this back, to let the people know?
Well, part of what we can do and what you're starting to do here is to tell the truth about August 8th so that there's no question about what the date is, and tell it to our children. You know, I honestly think we're being sidetracked by issues because we are trying to invent a cultural connection to keep us together. That's what Kwanzaa is all about. Now, forgive me for saying this, but Kwanzaa has no meaning. Kwanzaa is not Kwanzaa was not born out of trauma. All significant holidays are born out of traumatic events, are born out of struggle. Kwanzaa was an intellectual concept by Ron Karenga, of course, after the Watts riots, but he felt that he needed to create some kind of cultural connection. But he didn't have to look very far. What happened to Emancipation Day? This is what we shouldn't be ashamed of that. We should be proud of what we came from. And I mean, nothing, but now you have stamps commemorating Kwanzaa and not Emancipation Day. Because Kwanzaa does not represent a threat. When I say threat, Kwanzaa does not contribute to our knowledge, does not contribute to our history, but Emancipation Day does. So why is there a Kwanzaa stamp and not an Emancipation Day stamp?
That reminded me of something that I don't think really came out in the panel discussion. Mr. Williams said, impressed me so deeply is that when we were talking to people, so many people would say, we didn't celebrate the 4th of July. The 4th of July. Now these are people in little country towns, way out there somewhere. We didn't celebrate the 4th of July. 4th of July was not Freedom and Independence Day for us. We celebrated the 8th of
That was Frederick Douglass.
And it really took me just a little while to hear what you would have heard immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what a powerful political statement that was. It wasn't just saying we had a party on Friday instead of Saturday.
Exactly.
It was am I hearing that?
Yeah, exactly.
It's like we're going to celebrate when we celebrate.
Right. It's Emancipation Day, right. Well, you know, we you know, we do share the 4th of July, and at some point, we will be celebrating it in earnest, but not right now. As Frederick Douglass said that at the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. What are we celebrating? Yes?
I'd like to say something. I think one of the things that is wrong with the American Negro, because I don't use the other that much, is the fact that this is our country. Now, whether anyone wants to accept us or not, this is our country. This is where we were born. Our ancestors may have come from Africa, but they enslaved, and then when the war was over and they were free, then they taught us to live the kind of life that we can live as human beings here in this country. And I think as I have grown up, it's always been a separation. As to the 8th of August was our day. We didn't have any part in it. Any other holiday, it was always belonging to the white man. But we shouldn't feel that. This is our country. We should fight for it. We need to get back to the point that we believe in God and let Him be our leader, because when I study history, that's where it all came from. If the slaves had not believed in God and the church and her home, we wouldn't be here today. And I think we need to realize that this is our country, no matter if no one wants us at all, but we fight for it.
Yes, this is our country, the same as it is with anyone else. And for the immigrant who comes here and has only been a citizen for a year, it's his or her country too. And if you're here, you're part of this country. It is our country. It belongs to everybody. Yes.
I think that it's our country in the sense that it's our legacy, and that our ancestors worked to build the wealth of this country. And we haven't been, you know, the check hasn't been cashed. We built it, our ancestors built it for free.
Yes.
Reparations.
Yeah. Well, the whole wealth of the West, not only the United States, but the whole wealth of the West is based on exploitation of others. But in all fairness, you know, as a people, we've all been exploiting each other in one way or another since the beginning of time. And we just have to come together as human beings and decide that it's time to stop exploiting each other and help each other. Because nobody has a monopoly on genocide. Nobody has a monopoly on helping. We're all in this together. And at some point in history, somebody was doing something to somebody else. And this earth is finite. It's not infinite. This earth is finite. And there's no place else to go. And we're finding that out by the day. And we just have to come together as human beings and say, this is our home, and we have to learn to live together. Because there really is no alternative.
Mr. Williams, you said something earlier that struck a note with me, and that is we've been sidetracked. In 1963, with integration, that was when we were sidetracked. We haven't been the same since. We were together pretty much. I know here, our school, it's got the proper material to use. We had the teachers to teach it to us.
Right, exactly.
But once we went to other schools and other places, then we
lost control of our children. We lost control of our children. Right.
So we have been sidetracked.
Yes.
And events like this and others you mentioned and others have mentioned
Sure.
will come back together. But it's going to take a while. Just reminding when Mary was talking, that it's talking with Mr. back there, it's going to take some time to do it.
Yes.
We want to reinvent the wheel, we don't have to do that. We just need to replace it.
Right. We don't have to reinvent the wheel because it's all in our history. All we have to do is recognize it. I mean, I mean, this man in the White House now hasn't learned from his father. And how close can you get other than the family dinner table? Right? I mean, that's real intimacy. And we're still making the same mistakes. And we just don't. Yes. Yes.
Here at Sussex College, and I just want to say that all the holidays that we have for Martin Luther King Day, and I think that whether we're black, white, orange, or whatever nationality we are, we should all celebrate not only that, but enjoy the fact that we're off work and we're out of class.
I didn't hear that very last part. Could you please repeat that?
I said we all should enjoy the fact that we're off work and a lot of other kids are out of class.
Any other? Yes, sure.
I was at a meeting once, about 2 weeks ago, and there was a young man there with his father, and his father said, "There goes Red Blooded American." And the little boy looked up at his father and said, "Dad, when will I become a Red Blooded American?"
Mm-hmm.
And his father looked down at him and said, "You are." And you know what he said? The little boy said, "Not in school."
Not in school. Well, yeah. Children echo the thoughts and feelings of their parents. And so, you can't look at the children, you have to look at the parents, you have to look at the upbringing. And
That's a strong statement.
it's a strong statement. So, we're xenophobic. We're afraid of something that's different than us. And if it isn't the color, well, in fact, we're all the same color. We're just different saturation levels of the same color. It's all melanin. But if it wasn't that, it'd be something else. I mean, in Ireland, they're all white. What's the difference there? Catholic and Protestant. In Iran, they're all Persian, but it's Shiite versus Sunni. So, as human beings, we just, we will do our darndest to find these differences, to put somebody else down. I mean, it's human nature. The first crime was infracticide, Cain and Abel. There were only 2 people, 4 people on the earth then. So, you say, well, what hope is there for us if there were just 4 people on the earth and one murders another? What are you going to do with 200 billion people?
But those folk were taught law.
Excuse me?
They were taught how to live right, but they become to the point where they want to do what was right in their own eyes. And when you come away from the foundation, it's
Right. Well, they left the foundation. But that's what I'm talking about. It seems to be human nature to leave the foundation. The foundation is all, God put the foundation there. I mean, the Garden of Eden. And what did Adam and Eve do with it? So, is there hope for us? So, okay.
I think there's hope for us in that right here, we're all here together, black and white, in a common cause. And like you said, I think above all, we have to learn to live together because we have no place else.
That's right, there's no place else to go. And yeah, we're finding that out, and hopefully we will make that decision. Yes. Yes, sir.
I would like to make a comment on these holidays, like the day for all the 4th of July. And West Tennessee, where I come from, we have white and black celebrating together.
Right.
Christmas, April,
Right.
Easter. We
Right.
all drink out of the same bottle, so holidays.
Right.
All after all.
Right. Yeah, we do. It comes down to what we celebrate together. Yeah. But the important point is having respect for each other's celebrations. And understanding why it's happening and being empathetic and enjoying it also. Yeah. Okay. Well, yes, sir.
Yeah, Doc, I just wanted to add, Brother Ripley mentioned earlier about being sidetracked. And I think, like our mother just said, if we as a people can realize the foundation on which this race was built, that eventually came into this emancipation that is being celebrated today, I think there is a dire need for us to go back to the old landmark. There is a portion in the book of Judges that says that there was another generation of the children of Israel that grew up and did not know the law.
Right, exactly.
And the implication there is that the previous generation did not pass down the tradition to them.
The traditions to them.
And so I think that when we will hold ourselves accountable, I came to this country and I'm working on a book, The Connection Between African Americans and West Africans, where the bulk of our people came from. And I interviewed some elderly people, and some of the answers I got was, well, my question was, why has things gone this way? And well, you know, we called help and we didn't want our children to go through the same thing that we went through. But the truth of the matter is, these things are still here. The black male is still an endangered, creature right in this country, and I would say it fearlessly. So if even we say we want to shield our children, eventually they got to interact with the larger society out there. So we must as well, arm them, prepare them to live here. If we're going to live here, we got to prepare them to live here and deal with all the other stigmas in the society that they must, encounter.
Well, when you talk about the black male being the endangered species, that's because the black male is deemed as a threat. Deemed as a threat. We've been demonized, we've been dehumanized, that's the way it is. But any threat to quote unquote so-called order is always demonized, and there's always the organization to keep it in its place. That's why you have a secret police, and every society has its secret police to keep threats in check, and that goes for anybody or anything. All cultures have very strong foundations, and if every culture and every religion would abide by its foundations, there wouldn't be any problems. It's those who stray from the foundation.
The deviants.
Those are the deviants, and you have deviants in every religion, every culture, and every race. And they're just deviants everywhere. And it's up to those who stay with the fundamentals to balance that. And it's a constant battle. Even both intra and extra cultural race. You've got to. It's the old good versus evil battle. And that's what we're constantly fighting about. Constantly working. It's in the Bible. It's in Dante's Inferno. It's in Aristotle, it's in Plato, it's in, well, not Plato, though. He was Alexander's, the Congress teacher. Anyway, any other questions? Well, I just want to, again, express my pleasure for allowing me to share this afternoon with you, and I thank you very much. And if you have any questions about any of the photographs there, you can go over and browse and look through them. I'll be glad to answer any additional questions you may have about them. Again, thank you so much.
15. So if you do leave the room, please be back by 3:15 for the next presentation.
I tell you, we're so pleased to have him. When we first learned of him, we thought, and who is this gentleman? So we did our research. Once we did our research, we're like, oh my goodness, we can't do without him. We got to have him here. And he accepted the invitation so well, and we were just so pleased that Jackie talked with him and spoke with him and got his confirmation that he will be here with us today and being part of this movement too. So this gentleman's name is Dr. Mitch Ketchum. Mitch received his bachelor's degree from Penn State University and his doctorate in history from Cornell. He is, I must change this, he's been promoted to the associate professor, not assistant any longer. So since we've been in touch with him, he's been promoted. So he is an associate professor of the African American history, historical memory, and public commemoration at Western Michigan University. Dr. Ketchum has written extensively on African American history and is the foremost historian in the country on the subject of the history of the Emancipation Day celebration in the U.S. Dr. Ketchum recently published The Festival of Freedom, Memory and Meaning in African American Emancipation Celebration 1808 through 1915. Audience, please help me welcome Dr. Ketchum to the podium.
I'm not going to use the podium because I want to get to the overhead projector, and I'm used to being in the classroom, so I think I can project well enough. Please let me know if I can't hear me, just kind of wave and I'll speak up a little bit, all right? And thank you for that nice introduction. I'm a little sort of, nervous about being presented as the foremost historian of anything, especially after all of the information. And one thing I should point out, as I was talking about the title of my book, the dates that it covers, I should emphasize 1808 to 1915. So most of what you've heard talked about today have to do with emancipation celebrations after the period in which I did my research. So, I certainly don't claim any expertise over August the 8th in particular. I don't claim any great expertise on the way emancipation is celebrated today in various parts of the country. I've learned a tremendous amount by listening to all of you today, and some of the speakers here, and the presentation by Daniel Williams and so on. So, and George White's, this is kind of like church, I think George White sort of delivered the rousing sermon, and I will pass the hat. So it all works out pretty well. So what I'd like to do with you today is to share with you some aspects of my research and try to relate it very specifically to this event that we're all taking part in today, and sort of cover three main topics, I guess. I do want to provide a brief historical overview of emancipation celebrations during the period which I've studied, from 1808 to 1915, just to give a little bit of that background on where some of these traditions come from. Secondly, I'd like to talk a bit about the different dates that are celebrated in different places. And, I don't have a full explanation for all of those, certainly. Some of them we may never fully understand why a particular date in a particular place. But I do want to talk about how that took shape in the 1800s. And third, I want to emphasize some of the important things that really connect with what's going on here today, and that's this regional networking, this regional coordination, and bringing together of people around emancipation celebrations. And in doing that, it struck me as I was reading some of the literature that the folks gave to me here, and I do want to thank Bill and Jacqueline and Alicia and everybody who's been involved in this. Everybody's been so gracious and kind and bringing me in here. And again, all of you for sharing. The folks this morning sharing their stories, that was just tremendous for me. I learned so much. And it really got the day started nicely, I think. But in reading some of this information, I was looking at the description of what CEDnet is all about. the Community Economic Development Network of East Tennessee. The purpose of CEDnet is to knit together community organizations across the region in order to speak with one voice, to help one another build capacity, and to support successful activities. And as I'll talk about a little bit more as I get into the presentation, that's a big part of what Emancipation celebrations were intended to do by the African American people and communities that organized them back in the 1800s when this whole tradition got started. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. Is it possible to bring down the front lights at least so we can see the images? Thank you. A little more clearly. I want to show some images. I don't have photographs for the most part, and certainly not anything that I've taken to compare with what Mr. Williams presented earlier. But I wanted to share some prints and lithographs and things from the 19th century. And in fact, this image was actually produced as a painting from 1905, so it's actually early 20th century. But it's what it's supposed to represent that's significant here, and it gets back to the roots of the Emancipation celebration tradition. You know, my book begins with the date 1808. Well, gosh, that's way before the emancipation of slavery, the end of slavery in the United States. In 1808, that was the year in which the U.S. Congress and Great Britain also passed laws outlawing the transatlantic slave trade. As of January 1st, 1808, according to the United States law, it was illegal to import slaves into the United States from Africa. It still went on after that, illegally, but the numbers dropped dramatically. African Americans in the northern states, in the South where slavery was deeply entrenched, there wasn't anything to celebrate. But in the northern states, in places like Boston and Philadelphia and New York and some other cities, they held celebrations of this event. And they held celebrations with public parades and meetings in church and speakers. And what this represents, not in a not terribly accurate way, is part of the procession. And what I want to emphasize here is these figures on horseback. I think Bill, when he was talking about one of the press clippings they found from a Greeneville celebration, talked about the officer of the day, a former slave of Andrew Johnson. Well, this is a deep tradition, and either the officer of the day or the chief marshal, as he was often referred to, a very significant figure, the leader of the event, on horseback, very well dressed with the top hat and long coat and the sash and ribbons, and his entourage here, the other officers of the day, mounted on horseback. This is in a time period when African Americans in the early 1800s, even those who were free, freedom was only a nominal status. It was not a true freedom in any sense of the word. They were severely restricted in what they could do in public. And these kinds of public statements of asserting their right to take to the streets and to parade and to celebrate freedom, or at least what they saw as a step toward freedom, was very important in establishing leadership in African American communities and their political rights as citizens. And these rights were widely denied. One thing I should emphasize here, Mr. Williams was talking about the 4th of July and the extent to which that really didn't have significance for Black Americans. Initially, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, Black Americans did have some ability to participate in July 4th celebrations, but by the early 1800s, they were forcibly excluded, often violently excluded from participating in 4th of July celebrations. If blacks would dare to even appear on the streets on July 4th, they were likely to be attacked by mobs of whites, usually whites who had been drinking some of that special water. Drunkenness was widespread, and blacks were targeted. And an interesting thing happens, and we shift from this image, maybe just hold off on the images for a bit. When some of the northern states, again, as David Williams mentioned, abolished slavery, in New York State, the official law abolishing slavery in New York took effect on July 4th, 1827, okay? And African Americans in New York debated about whether they should celebrate on July 4th or not, because it was dangerous for them to take to the streets. And to take to the streets celebrating their freedom, a freedom with which many white Americans deeply resented and resisted, that was a huge debate, especially if they were going to parade. Many people said, well, if we're going to celebrate, maybe we should not parade and just have a meeting in the church and have speeches and things like that and make it a more private affair. So what happened is, in 1827 in New York City, there were two celebrations. One was an indoor celebration at a church that didn't have a parade, and the other took place on July 5th. Partly to escape the violence that was likely to come about on July 4th, and partly as a protest against the idea of July 4th being Independence Day, because it didn't mean independence for African American people. It was independence for white people, and blacks being targeted on that day. So July 5th, the parade took place, and this was something of a tradition of a July 5th parade for several years in New York State. Now, just a word about the parades in general, to tie into this history, and to use another image here, not of African Americans in a parade, but an image from the early 1830s celebrating George Washington's 100th birthday in 1832. I'm not sure how well this shows up, but what I want to emphasize is here, a huge throng of people marching here. There's a wagon being drawn by horses, flags and banners flying. Parading was an important political statement in the early 1800s. It was an important way for these kinds of public commemorative events to be celebrated, to be acknowledged. It was an important way for political protest to take place, for working men's groups to put their views before the public. It was an important way for temperance activists, temperance being the attempt to limit or ban the use of alcohol. They would march through the streets, making their political claims to outlaw the use of alcohol. Bible societies would march through the streets. So marching through the streets was an important political act, and African Americans wanted to participate in that. Parading was important to them because they were citizens. They wanted to claim that right of citizenship, which was often denied them. So this is just an example of the kinds of parades that took place. Now, as has been mentioned before, one of the, probably the most important event that was celebrated by black Americans before the Civil War was the emancipation of slaves in the British colonies, in Canada, in the British West Indies, and also in Asia. The area where it had the most significance for black Americans was the emancipation of slaves in the West Indies, like Jamaica, the Bahamas, the English colonies, and the Caribbean. Close to 800,000 slaves were freed. The first act was passed on August 1st, went into effect August 1st, 1834. Although it wasn't a full slavery, there was sort of a transitional period. It became full and final as of August 1st, 1838. And at that point, black Americans, and actually white American abolitionists as well, started to celebrate on August 1st. The research that I have done has focused on celebrations that were organized and conducted by African Americans. I wasn't so much looking at what white American abolitionists were doing. There was a lot of crossover because the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement that really started to accelerate in the 1830s was very much a biracial movement. Whites and blacks working together, not always agreeing with each other, and blacks and whites not always agreeing with each other either about tactics, strategies, whether to use violence or not, and so on. But it was a biracial movement. But to a large extent, but white abolitionist societies organized their own events, and certainly African Americans participated in those. And there was a significant degree of white participation in events organized by black Americans. But I was really interested in looking at the celebrations organized by African Americans. So these West Indian emancipation celebrations, which were held on August 1st, all across the northern states, again, with slavery deeply rooted in the South. You did not see those celebrations there. It would have been, it really had no meaning for African Americans in the South. It would have been dangerous for them to try to mount a celebration. That certainly would have been put down immediately in that repressive regime in the southern states. So in Tennessee, for example, I have no evidence of any of these August 1st celebrations taking place before the Civil War era, before U.S. emancipation. But in places like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and New York, and then westward into Ohio and Indiana, I have evidence of celebrations from Massachusetts to San Francisco during the 1840s and 1850s, and many, many places in between. Hundreds of these celebrations took place in the 1830s, well, mostly in the 1840s and 50s. And what I have on the overhead here is a flyer. And unfortunately, in all the research I've done, I've not been able to come up with an actual image of either a photograph or a lithograph, a print of some kind, showing an African American celebration from the 1840s and 50s. Interested in it, I'm still looking. Maybe Mr. Williams has seen something in his work and could share that with me. But I have found this image of a flyer. Okay, it was called a broadside. Something would be like put up on the side of a wall to advertise things. Something like this would have been printed in a newspaper. This organization called the Bannocker Institute. Does that name ring a bell with anybody?
Yeah, Benjamin Bannocker.
Right, Benjamin Bannocker. It's a well-informed group. Benjamin Bannocker, late 18th century, he was born a free man in Maryland, a very accomplished mathematician and surveyor, wrote an almanac, and wrote some very famous protest letters to Thomas Jefferson challenging his racial views, and so on. A very important early African-American intellectual figure. A group of young men in Philadelphia formed this Bannocker Institute as a society for educating themselves. They studied together, they discussed books and papers, they wrote papers and debated with one another, and they organized emancipation celebrations, celebrating West Indian emancipation. Now, I mean, one question, why was this so important to Black Americans? One thing to keep in mind is that in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, Great Britain was sort of the superpower of its day. It had the sun never sets on the British Empire is a common expression. And they had political and military and economic power far beyond really any other nation in the world at that time. And what they did mattered to everyone. And especially the British had important economic and political ties and cultural ties with the United States. So it was hoped by both Black and white abolitionists that this major path-breaking act on the part of the British government, abolishing slavery in all of its colonies, would have an impact, would inspire anti-slavery people in the United States to put more pressure on Congress or the President to act against slavery here. It didn't really have that effect, but Black and white abolitionists used these events as political statements. And more than political statements, when I talk about these events, I like to talk about three different kinds of functions that they serve. They allowed people to congregate, they were opportunities to educate, and they were opportunities to agitate. One thing, and this first thing, congregation, relates very much to what's going on here today. And that's why this is a very interesting and important event to me, because it has people coming in from all around the region here, from outside the region, from Kentucky, from out of state, and sharing ideas. And part of that CEDnet statement of purpose that I read at the beginning is a big part of what was going on here. Congregating. A lot of people in the North, Philadelphia had a pretty good sized Black population, New York, Boston, but a lot of free Blacks in the North in the 1840s and 50s were kind of spread out in small towns, in rural areas. They were farmers, they were laborers in small towns, and there weren't large numbers of Black people, and Black communities were pretty small in a lot of these areas. But on August 1st, these communities would often come together, so that there's a little town in the Finger Lakes area of central New York called Canandaigua. In fact, let me skip ahead here and put up a map that I was going to put up later. Now, I'll use it now because that's sort of where I ended up. We're talking about these community institutions. Now I'll get back to the Bannocker Institute. Okay, geography time here, and hopefully this will show up to some degree. All right, here we've got Pennsylvania, here's New York, up here with a cross-hatching is Lake Ontario, okay, general idea, bear with me. A little town called Candlelight, New York, which is located right there. Probably nobody here's heard of this town. It's a little town now, it was a little town then. Maybe a few dozen black families lived in this town. But in the 1850s, they held emancipation celebrations there. It would draw thousands of people. Many whites would attend, sometimes sort of equal numbers of blacks and whites attending these celebrations. But in a town with maybe a couple hundred African American residents, you'd have a couple thousand African Americans in town on the Emancipation Day, August 1st, and probably a couple thousand whites. Thousands of people, and they would be there listening to speeches. There would be parades where black organizations, literary societies, the Prince Hall Masons or the Odd Fellows, these male fraternal organizations, marching bands, and of course, again, you'd have on horseback the officers of the day, the chief marshal and his officers. You'd have floats, often with women or young girls dressed in white dresses representing the freedom in the free states on a float. And again, I wish I had images showing this, but newspaper descriptions describe all these parades. Some of them a procession a mile long. They would go through town, and it would end at a speaker's platform, either in town or in a grove outside of town. Like people were talking about this woodland lake, which it seemed like was a place that was outside of town that people would go out to, and there was sort of more open space to congregate. I'm not sure, but that's the impression I got. And the Greeneville celebration, coming from town there out to somewhere near Tusculum, it got the impression that there was sort of an outdoor area. This was very common back in the 1840s and 50s. So people would get together and congregate and socialize. One of the gentlemen this morning was saying, I heard about this emancipation. What is this emancipation celebration? Oh, we're going to have barbecue. The women will all be out. Okay? This is, it's kind of, it's funny, I laughed then too. But really, think about it. If you're in a small town in central New York, a free black in the 1850s, and there's maybe 100 African American people in your town, marrying white folks was not really, a possibility, even if you wanted to. How are you going to find a mate? These annual events were good ways to meet people from around the region, meet people of the opposite sex. So those kinds of social functions were very important. And I don't have a lot of documentation for that, but I have a little bit. Sojourner Truth met her first husband apparently at a celebration of some kind in the early 1800s. And the great bluesman W.C. Handy said that he met his wife at an emancipation celebration in the late 1800s. And just two little anecdotal pieces of evidence. So these social aspects, and also things like finding a job. Okay, jobs were hard to come by. Blacks were relegated to the lowest, the meanest jobs that whites didn't want to take. How would you find some kind of occupation? Well, through these celebrations, maybe you could hook up with someone who is a barber in another town. That was one of the best jobs an African American could get in the mid-19th centuries, to be a barber. And many prominent figures were barbers. Maybe you could get your son hooked up with someone in another town who was a barber, and he could apprentice with him. And in this way, people came together and congregated, socialized, and there was a feeling of power in coming together from around the community and saying, look, our numbers are more than just who we are in this little small town. We have a broader identity than that. So congregating was important. And what I have, these circles I draw on the map, is evidence that I have of folks who went to celebrations in Canandaigua. These are all places where celebrations took place. These little towns, Penn Yan, Rochester, Canandaigua, Bath, New York, Ithaca, Watkins Glen, Elmira, Binghamton. And people would come from miles around, sometimes 50 or even 100 miles, to come to these celebrations. And this is all documented in the historical records through newspapers. And there was a conscious coordination of these folks coming together. Frederick Douglass, participated in a lot of these celebrations. And in 1857, actually at a celebration in Canandaigua, he said, "I like these annual celebrations because they call us to the contemplation of great interests and afford an opportunity of presenting salutary truths before the American people. They bring our people together and enable us to see and commune with each other to mutual profit." So this sharing of information, this sharing of experiences, and also people like Douglas would deliver orations, sometimes talking for 2 or 3 hours. This is a big form of entertainment, believe it or not, to listen to someone speak for 2 or 3 hours. And Frederick Douglass does a much better job than I do. So, someone you could listen to for that long. But he would speak for hours, and he would use those speeches as history lessons. So again, one of the other functions, as I said, to educate. Not only bring people together, but now that you've got them together, and think about the way that blacks were excluded from the opportunity to educate themselves in a formal way, excluded from the common schools. Certainly those who were enslaved are strictly forbidden to learn to read and write, okay? So even among free blacks, literacy rates are not terribly high in the 1850s. But they come to these celebrations and they hear Frederick Douglass speak, and he speaks about the glories of ancient Egypt and the knowledge and power of ancient Egypt, an ancient African civilization that was sort of the foundation of the sciences and the arts and the philosophy of the Western world. He would speak about the anti-slavery movement in England. He would speak about the anti-slavery movement in the United States and talk about the great leaders who were trying to organize an anti-slavery movement there and try to recruit people into that cause. And this was a very empowering thing for many African Americans. Here's an example of a gentleman named William Henry Hurd, who eventually became a bishop of the AME Church in the early 1900s, talked about going to an emancipation celebration